Sorry about that. So I don't think anybody will miss too badly our introductions. But just sort of our Muscatine chapter progress update. We currently have 45 chapter members and are continuing to grow, which is, that's astounding. We're a relatively new BRG, and it's just amazing that, we're continuing to grow. So thank you all for your support. We have a pride-themed garden, thriving insight pollinator. It's thriving in the site pollinator garden. Sorry. So yeah, go check that out if you haven't seen that. We are working on adding a gender-neutral, second gender-neutral restroom in 2025. That is actually complete now in the front hallway here of admin building. We are sponsoring Iowa City Pride in 2025. Yeah, some of our events include Bear National Day of Pride, LGBTQ plus History Month, and Valentine's Day. So hopefully maybe you attended some of those. Yeah. Iowa City Pride. So this is Saturday, June 21st. We are looking for volunteers. There is a sign-up sheet there in the back. The more the merrier, whether it is manning the booth or walking with us in the parade. Last year, we had some pretty good participation, looking to hopefully match that this year. Yeah, I don't know, it's a pretty neat experience. It's a fun way to spend a Saturday. Yeah, we are an official silver level sponsor of Iowa City Pride. Like I said, looking for volunteers, contact myself or Laura or sign up on the sheet in the back. Yeah, so I sort of skipped myself with the introductions. We're sort of going to be getting into the meat of this now. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Geraldine or Lynn Frasco. I was born in 1992, assigned male at birth. That's what that acronym means. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. Yeah, I mean, obviously that affected my upbringing. Started working at Bayer here in 2016. Married to a cisgender woman in 2019. Discovered that I was a transgender woman and a lesbian, ? Part of the fun of rediscovering myself is, well, you're discovering yourself. But anyway, discovered that in 2021. Joined Blend and came out at work in 2022. What a scary experience. I mean, not just here at Bear, but just everywhere. Every time coming out, it's a new adventure, but extremely rewarding as well. Very happy that I could bring my full self to work here. And then, yeah, in the real world, I enjoy board games and hanging out with friends. Just one last thing before jumping into the presentation itself. Why does Blend exist? This is something that, get asked from time to time, and I just sort of wanted to self-promote here a little bit. So first off, Blend's mission statement is to create a better work environment for LGBTQ plus employees as a strategic partner in inclusivity, advancement, and authentic representation. That's a very, corporate saying, but it's true. We want to build that more inclusive environment. I could speak for everybody on the leadership team. We're all passionate about doing what we can. We are a business resource group. That's what BRG stands for, right? We are here for you. The fact that you're here is of course, is of course awesome, and hopefully you get something out of today's presentation. But we do exist outside Pride Month. So if you ever have anything LGBTQ plus related, primarily at the workplace, but we'll support how we can outside the workplace as well. If there is anything that we can do to help make the workplace feel more inclusive, please let us know. We really want to, do what we can. That's why we exist. So, okay. So the premise of this, sort of presentation, LGBTQ plus history. So what sort of going to show here today is that history is full of LGBTQ plus individuals. Often their queer identities are minimized or erased. And frequently, these individuals, they're the individuals that have made a difference throughout history. They're erased altogether, even. This presentation aims to illustrate that queer individuals are a part of our shared history, whether you are part of the queer community or not. And then we'll highlight the struggles that queer folks have gone through and the strides that have been made. A common argument that you'll hear is like, these new ideologies, like they came out of nowhere and, this is all like some big fad or whatever. One of the things I hope to show during this presentation is that could not be farther from the truth. Yeah, so the trouble with history, I think most of the people in this room knows the Swiss cheese model a little bit too well. It applies to process safety. It also applies to history. So over here on the left, you might have a historical event, sometime way in the past. Well, in order for it to get to your awareness, it has to pass through all these different barriers, First, there's just the passage of time, If you're looking at events from, 2,000 years ago, even the best of history, it decays over time and it gets harder to find. And yeah, there's archaeology, there's studies and blah, blah, blah. But the further in the past you go, the harder it is to have much clarity as to what really happened back then. You also have history sort of, it's a little bit of a game of telephone. Yes, archaeology, looking at primary sources, can, that's going to be the best, of course. But all in all, primary sources are rare. It's very hard to be able to, especially with something like queer identity, finding a pottery fragment probably isn't going to tell you their identity. So, for example, you have European monks, and Victorian scholars and, everybody and their mother has, touched, these, little bits of history until we get to today. And your awareness, it's affected by everything that came before it, whether you realize it or not. The language has evolved over time. The word homosexual, it didn't really come around until 1868 was the first time it was written down. Lesbian 1870, going all the way down to the word transgender only really came about in 1974. Does that mean these concepts are new, that people before 1868 were, none of them were homosexual? No, of course not. The words are new, but the experience is timeless. It does make it hard to study history, though. We might read about, XYZ experiences from somebody in the past, but can we classify them, for example, as transgender by today's modern standards? It gets tricky. It gets really tricky. History is big. It's impossible to know everything. Nobody here in this room is a professional historian. Most members of the public, they might only know a couple of facts. about certain historical figures. Like, for example, Alexander the Great, Leonardo da Vinci. We have pretty good evidence that, that they were, maybe bisexual or some version of queer. That's not really like the most important thing about them. They're known for, well, other things. So your general awareness might not be, super high about, again, their, queer identities. As well as due to some of what we've already talked about, it's hard to even know with certainty the queer status of historical figures. Again, like, did, Leonardo da Vinci call himself gay or homosexual? Like, no. And in fact, as we'll see later on, being able to openly admit that at certain points in history, it was possibly punishable by death even. So, that definitely makes it harder to study these past figures. I'm also going to drop a vocab word on you here, cis heteronormativity. It's a lot of syllables, but basically all that means is that historians and really the general public has the general assumption that until proven otherwise, people are cisgender, meaning not transgender. They are cisgender and straight unless proven otherwise. Again, that's just sort of the starting assumption. And then you have to prove that, they are some version of queer. And a lot of times in history, there's reasonable doubt is the way I would describe it. Where, we can say with like maybe, probably, but again, you're sort of working uphill because the starting assumption is that, again, they are cis and straight. Okay, so let's start going through history, and we're actually going to start before history. Okay, we're starting with the animal kingdom here. I think everybody sort of understands that sexual relations in animals are much more free in the animal kingdom. We as humans put a lot of pressure on sex, and that's not really the case most of the time in the animal kingdom. Same-sex relations are significantly more common. Same-sex relations have been observed in 1,500 different species. It's out there. Like, I mean, it's undeniable. A lot of the times you'll hear words like crimes against nature or, it's unnatural, that sort of thing. But again, it's, our closest living relatives, bonobos, along with chimpanzees. Bonobos, as much as 60% of all their sexual interactions are female to female. Again, just sort of, again, like what is natural. I did like this little like just headline here. Same-sex sexual behavior in chimpanzees challenge our gendered biases about evolution. The big question is, how did we manage to miss these behaviors in chimpanzees for so long? And I mean, spoiler alert, it's confirmation bias. It's a lot of what we've already talked about, this cis heteronormativity, that people see what they want to see. Jane Goodall wrote about, same-sex relations in chimpanzees, and she's like, well, it's not for procreation, blah, 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 does it really count? And it's like, yeah, like you sort of see what you want to see a little bit. Sexual characteristics. This is where again, nature is weird. So people talk about chromosomes all the time and that sort of thing. The animal kingdom, like it's it's bananas. Yes, you have your XY chromosomes. You also have XO chromosomes, ZW, ZO, again, just sort of depending on your species. Sex might not even be determined by your chromosomes. It might be determined by something such as temperature. Some species have more than two sexes, or they might only have one sex. This is, I believe, the yellow-throated lizard, if I remember correctly. These are all nominally, male lizards, but they all exhibit different physical characteristics that are, differentiated. They're very well studied. Again, are they sexes, whatever, it depends on who you ask, but, fascinating subject. Again, nature is weird. Intersex population, so, individuals that share characteristics of male and female. It could be as high as 10% in some species, so rather common. Sexual dimorphism could be extreme. Again, like the natural assumption that like males are dominant and bigger and blah, 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 that's a very narrow view, I guess. This is the male anglerfish. It's sort of a parasite on the much larger female. Again, just nature's great. Yeah, some change their sex over their lives. I know like clownfish are a famous example. And then some may never pursue sex, called drones, where they're not sexually viable. Again, I say all this to say the animal kingdom is weird. So when you hear things like, oh, it's not natural, blah, 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 keep in mind what nature is. Nature is varied. All right, but let's get into humans. This is the reason that you all probably came here. So we're basically starting at the beginning of recorded history. We only have writing, period, from about 3000 BC, with when cuneiform was created in Sumeria. The earliest evidence of same-sex relations comes from the 24th century BC. So that is like 5,000 years ago, almost. No, more, yeah, almost 5,000 years ago. This is a engraving that was found in Egypt. I'm not going to try to pronounce their names, but these are two males that are shown in a way that is traditionally, Egyptian traditionally shown for, couples, basically. And again, we're like sort of at the beginning of recorded history right now. Certain classes of gender nonconforming individuals exist in several societies. I just have like one little like example here about the Inaria. They are part of the Scythians. The Inaria were feminine-presenting priests who were male by sex. They wore women's clothing, performed women's jobs, and spoke like women. Scythians viewed the Inaria as essentially different than most men due to divine transformation. The Inaria were respected by their communities and belonged to the most powerful level of Scythian aristocracy. They likely practiced same-sex eroticism and did not engage in heterosexual sex. The Scythians believed the Inaria were repeatedly born into certain families, and this was often ascribed to a goddess's hereditary curse upon warriors who had sacked her temple. Ancient history is fun. But again, like, do these individuals qualify as transgender? Like, again, history is weird. We just have fragmented sort of writings about figures such as this. Similarly, it influences mythology. If I could get a movie about one Greek hero, it would be about Tiresias. According to this historian, Tiresias was originally a woman who had promised Apollo her favors in exchange for musical lessons, only to reject him afterwards. She was turned by Apollo into a man, then again a woman under unclear circumstances, then a man by the offended Hera, then into a woman by Zeus. She became a man once again after an encounter with the Muses, until finally Aphrodite turned him into a woman again, and then into a mouse. I don't know. Tiresias is presented as a complex liminal figure mediating between humankind and the gods, male and female, blind and seeing, present and future, this world and the underworld. Again, ancient history is fun. Yeah, it's complex. Again, this is mythology. This is not history, of course, but quite often, we believe that mythology is modeled after real world experiences. So 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, was there somebody that, changed their, gender presentation in ancient Greece? Like, maybe, much of the nuance has been lost to time or purposeful obfuscation, where, yeah, like we don't know, but again, the starting assumption is that, these people in the past are cisgender, straight, whatever, and then you have to sort of prove them otherwise. Sort of moving forward in time a little bit, we sort of entered the classical period. We have a bit better records from this time period. Bisexuality was often the norm during this time. Third genders often served religious roles, we already talked about a little bit, as well as, it carried forward into like, the Romans. This fun little tidbit about the Galli breaking Roman gender norms. The Galli were priests in the cult of the goddess Cybele. They may have been devoted specifically to her consort Attis, who had castrated himself in a fit of divine frenzy. An initiation to the cult of the Galli also castrated themselves, and afterwards dressed exclusively in clothing. They therefore occupied an ambiguous space in Roman notions of gender that many modern transgender and non-binary people have identified with. Yeah, I mean, again, just sort of the past. It's an interesting space. Is this a religious cult? Are they, transgender individuals? Are they both? It's impossible to say, really. The Theban sacred band from the city-state of Thebes in Greece consisted of 150 homosexual pairs, totaling up to 300 altogether. They defeated the Spartans at Leuctra. This was not just some, offshoot whatever. This was the greatest army of the region at the time. The Spartans were no slouches. Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, was assassinated by a gay lover. If Alexander the Great wasn't Alexander the Great, we would probably all know about Philip II of Macedon. He conquered, all the way up. He built the army that Alexander the Great took to defeat the Persians. Yeah, like I said, it's fascinating story. I recommend looking into it at some point. Agabus, Roman emperor, said, "Call me not Lord, for I am a lady." I bring up all these examples just to say that, at this period of time, this was part of the norm. This was not anything revolutionary. Everybody sort of views were complex. Like, for example, in homosexual relationships at this time, there was quite often a sort of like it's called pedestry. It's sort of like an older figure, younger figure type of thing, which, by our modern standards is, not great. But, there were different views depending on which partner you were and that sort of thing. So again, like, it's very hard for us to put our modern views onto the past. But just know that these things were commonplace. Then we enter the Middle Ages. So this is where Christianity and the church really started to take hold and have power. We had the fall of the Roman Empire around 500 AD, depending on which historian you ask. But I cannot overstate the importance that religion played during this time. Not just like going to church or whatever, but I'm talking about like how it impacted the way people think, the way people act. There's this theological concept called natural law. All should act in accordance with the vision of the divine. This is foundational in early Jewish and Christian doctrine. And in particular, this applied to not just homosexual relationships, but all sexual relationships, where the purpose of sex was procreation. So if you got enjoyment out of it, you are sinning against God. If you are, going against, the way you are born, transgender individuals, again, you are sinning against God. And that is something that is, it affected every aspect of life. Every act has a purpose. Punishments varied by region and time period, but often resulted in execution. Burnings were common, where it was seen as heresy to be engaging in these acts. This is fun. Quite often, Bibles were, they were written with like artwork in the margins and that sort of thing. These are a couple pairs of, homosexual lovers surrounded by devils, okay, where you are going to hell if you are, engaging in this. I also wanted to share this because I thought it was fun. Joan of Arc in the 1400s, she fought the English in the 100 Years' War, was captured, and was nominally put on trial for heresy. She was hearing voices from saints, she claimed, and that sort of thing. A little bit of a lesser known fact today, but was important at the time, was the fact that she cross-dressed. She dressed as a man. Okay, so her trial is actually extremely well documented. And I'll just read this little tidbit. This is the 13th session, so it goes to show how long this went on. But throughout the trial, Joan had been requesting to hear Mass, which had been refused to her. She was asked whether or not it would be proper for her to attend church wearing men's clothing or women's clothing. Joan of Arc, promise me that I'll get to hear Mass if I wear women's clothing. The interrogator, I promise that you will hear Mass if you wear women's clothing. Joan, and what do you say if I've promised our king and sworn not to remove these clothes? Nonetheless, I say, make me a long robe that touches the ground with no train and give it to me for Mass. Then when I come back, I'll put back on these clothes I'm wearing. So Joan of Arc, trans Mass king? Maybe, I don't know. Again, it's hard to say. But at this time, gender roles were very rigid. And yeah, what actually ended up happening was at the end of the trial, Joan of Arc was acquitted as long as she, promised that you're not hearing voices and you're going to dress in women's clothing and that sort of thing. That literally lasted 48 hours, and she ended up going back to men's clothing, and she was subsequently burned at the stake. So yeah, not a happy ending for Joan of Arc, unfortunately, but this was a very rough time to be a member of the queer community. Starting to enter the early modern period, so this sort of time, 1500 to 1800, where power started shifting from the church to the state, nation states. Laws became increasingly codified and harsh. This is sort of the time of, over the course of 300 years, the time of absolute monarchy. Very strict laws that were punishing. Heresy, was the word that was used. It began to be replaced with crimes against nature. In 1533 in England, it was the Buggery Acts, I believe, which again just sort of it didn't really go into too much detail. It was purposely vague and widely applied. Yeah, moral panics. So it wasn't just top down. There were also a series of moral panics and witch hunts. With queer folks, they sort of acted as frequent scapegoats. This is from one moral panic in the Netherlands in 1731. Where it decries sodomites and that sort of thing, where I think it was like 5,000 gay men were killed during this time. Molly houses sprung up and acted as early safe spaces. This is a contemporary painting, sort of showing the swapping of gender roles and that sort of thing, which at the time was, scandalous. These Molly houses, like I said, they were safe places. They were also quite often cracked down on. They acted as safe places for a time, but, whatever. They were illegal, I guess. Also briefly want to talk about this figure because I think he's interesting. This is the story of Antonio / Catalina de Rosso. He was born female, was a nun. That's why he's affectionately known as the Lieutenant Nun. He escaped the convent, went to America, actually acted as a Spanish conquistador for a little while. So, I mean, not the greatest of guys, but he was quite famous at the time in the 1500s here. Well-known story. That's another thing too, is a lot of times if you were high up in society, if you were, for example, a successful conquistador with lots of treasure, you could sort of get away with some of this stuff a little bit. If you were, some low-born peasant, you're probably not going to have a very good time. Sort of moving into the Victorian period, slowly grinding our way forward through time. Around 1800, I mean, it was a few decades long period if you count Napoleon and all that, was the French Revolution. This was, very transformational in the way that states viewed law and order. Up until that point, absolute monarchy ruled the day. It became more lax during this time. They sort of had to. They feared the people. And executions became much more rare, not just for homosexual activity, but any sort of illegal activity. Executions became much more rare. However, oppressive moral codes emerged. The Victorians are well known for their very strict moral codes. I'll read this quote right here. Victorian morality was a surprising new reality. The changes in moral standards and actual behavior across the British were profound. Historian Harold Perkin wrote, between 1780 and 1850, the English ceased to be one of the most aggressive, brutal, rowdy, outspoken, riotous, cruel, and bloodthirsty nations in the world, and became one of the most inhibited, polite, orderly, tender-minded, prudish, and hypocritical. And there's a lot of debates. I am certainly not qualified to weigh in about, how Victorian morals came to the forefront, how this transformation happened. But it had a very profound effect on the queer communities, where, they, it of course wasn't, very open leading up to this, but it certainly didn't help. The Victorian era saw a very harsh, squashing of any sort of counterculturalism. That's not to say it didn't exist entirely. Bohemianism rose. There was sort of this pervading mentality of don't ask, don't tell, where outwardly people were polite and such, but inwardly, in the privacy of their homes, things were much more liberal. I included this because I thought it was fun. I'm not here to tell you that Abraham Lincoln was gay, but the sexuality of Abraham Lincoln has been a topic of historical speculation and research. No such discussions have been documented during or shortly after Lincoln's lifetime. However, in the 19th century, sexuality and same-sex attraction were not often discussed. In recent decades, circa 1995, some writers have discussed purported evidence that he may have been homosexual. Again, I am not qualified to weigh in. I'm not here to tell you that Abraham Lincoln was gay, but I am here to say that this time, the 1800s, was a time where you weren't able to talk about this sort of thing. No, they weren't getting executed or anything like that, but it was a time of, the best word I have for it is moral repression. The era saw a romanticization and sanitation of history. So quite often history was viewed as an art rather than a science. And going all the way to today, some people still debate that, where history was it was used as a moral lesson. The purpose of history during this time wasn't to report the facts, it was to tell a story. And the story that a lot of Victorian historians wanted to tell was one of the glorious chivalric King Arthur, where that's where that sort of myth that we still live with today came from. And they sort of, whitewashed a lot of history during this time. I will say during this time also, there are undercurrents of higher moral consciousness. It was during this period that slavery was abolished, temperance and the suffragette movements gained momentum. So there was sort of this undercurrent. This is Oscar Wilde. He was a very famous playwright in England during the late 1800s. And he famously was put on trial for homosexual activity. And he was ultimately convicted. At the time, it was one of the earliest examples of a celebrity trial that I think a lot of us are familiar with today. But at this period, this was a scandal. And the public was, split. That's what makes it a good scandal. Because Oscar Wilde was immensely popular. At the same time, there were sort of these moral standards that said that, being gay, being homosexual was, it was deplorable. It was a moral sort of undermining. And it was a very, harsh subject at the time. We have to turn of the century. Things started to crack down, break up with the, diminishing of Victorian standards. Cracks were starting to emerge in Victorian culture. This was ultimately shattered by the Great War, World War I. Any sort of illusions of romanticism and that sort of thing with the world was quite often, it was shattered in the minds of a lot of people. There were movements such as, the New Woman, which is sort of like exemplified here. This is sort of like a satirical piece a little bit, but, you see a woman smoking and, and wearing male clothing. And this was unheard of just, a few decades earlier. As well as jazz, again, imagine jazz in Victorian England. Like, we're really not that far off from that. But it was sort of this cultural revolution. We had the foundation of clinical psychology. What I find interesting is that homosexuality was not initially treated as a condition. I say that because later on it will be. But here's a little quote from Sigmund Freud, which, Sigmund Freud's his own controversial figure, but I like the quote. Many highly respectable individuals of ancient and modern times have been homosexuals, several of the greatest men among them. It is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime. Sigmund Freud believed that homosexuality could not be cured. He was asked that. He believed that perhaps you could induce new feelings and blah, 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 but you could not get rid of the old feelings, which, again, whatever, just something I find interesting. There was the first homosexual movement. This I find, really neat. It was centered in Germany, which, if you know what comes next, is, anyway. It was sort of a period where you sort of had advancements in medicine. Some of the, early like transsexual surgeries and that sort of thing were being pioneered at this time, as well as hormone replacement therapy. What's sort of interesting, and I wanted to share this, cross-dressing was illegal during this time. However, they recognized what they called transvestites, where this is a transvestite pass. So what that basically means is if you had this transvestite pass, you could, if you were being accused of cross-dressing, you could show them the pass and then you're okay. Okay, so cross-dressing was illegal, but being transgender or whatever the equivalent is, that was okay at the time. Again, just it's sort of interesting by modern standards, but this was sort of a good time, not perfect, that's not ideal, but this was a relatively good time for queer folks. And this is a setup for what comes next, the rise of ideologies. So the Great Depression began in 1929. It was a massively destabilizing force in many nations. It wasn't just the United States by any means. It affected, the global economy. And they saw, depending on where you went, that there was a perceived decline in morality that was decried and cracked down on. In 1933, Nazi Germany, the Institute of Sexual Science, which, studied a lot of these, like surgeries and medical options that I mentioned, this was raided. They forcibly broke in, took their library of around 20,000 books and burned them. That image is from that exact book burning. The USA, it was certainly not as extreme, but we had our own sort of flavor. In the USA, the Comstock Act of 1873, this was something that was originally created to crack down on the distribution of abortion materials. It was an anti-vice law, and it was much more broadly applied during this time, where mail was monitored, you might be added to watch lists and that sort of thing. And of course, we had the Holocaust. It was perpetrated, and this represented perhaps the largest, most severe persecution of LGBTQ plus folks in history. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I think it's like 10,000 homosexuals were, killed during this time, with many more arrested and, sent to concentration camps. Part of what makes their story particularly tragic is when the Allies came through, they freed the concentration camps and that sort of thing. A lot of these homosexuals, they didn't get to go home. Because being gay was still illegal in the victor states. So a lot of times, maybe they weren't in a concentration camp anymore, but they went straight to jail. And I don't know, I can't imagine anything, more tragic than that. These victims were not recognized until 1985. So that's 4 decades later. Yeah, I think a lot of people are vaguely familiar with this, where, the Nazis, they categorized people. They split them up and they categorized them and marked them. And yeah, it's a very sad chapter in human history. Things didn't get better immediately for queer folks. We had the Lavender Scare. So this ran parallel to the Red Scare. Again, not a super great time in American history, where there was the fear of the communists and spies and that sort of thing. Queer folks were considered high risk because they could be blackmailed, a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation, if you ask me. So they were cracked down on. So just a couple examples. There was the Pervert Elimination Campaign of 1947. This focused on the DC area, which was sort of a hotbed of homosexual activity at the time. Executive Order 10450, I believe it was signed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. It fired 5,000 federal employees who were homosexual. And the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in government report. One thing I will note about each of these, yes, 5,000 federal employees were fired, in a nation of however many, 100 million, that's not a big number, but it affects the culture and the perception, and that's where there are cascading effects that are impossible to really quantify. And this was a time of, again, like sort of this, I don't know if repression is quite the right word because they sort of had to, but maybe suppression is maybe a better word. Early resistant movements started springing up. There was the countercultural mood of the 1960s. The flashpoint was coming. You sort of had protests like this, homosexual citizens want their right to make their maximum contribution to society. This was sort of the prevailing sort of attitude. One thing we're going to see very shortly is the countercultural movement. This is sort of where, homosexuality, and queer folks at large are trying to integrate, into society. They're doing things the quote unquote right way. And they weren't really getting much luck. And that brings us to Stonewall. Stonewall is the start of the modern queer movement. It is an extremely well studied event. If you've never heard of Stonewall before, we're gonna, run through it, of course. But it cannot be overstated how revolutionary this was. So let's sort of set the scene a little bit. We're going to zoom in on this place and time. So Stonewall Inn, it was located in the Greenwich Village in New York City. Sodomy was illegal during this time, as was cross-dressing. I find this interesting. It's a little factoid. LGBTQ plus people were regularly arrested for violating what became known as the 3-article rule, or the 3-piece law. The rule stipulated that a person was required to wear at least 3 gender-appropriate articles of clothing to avoid arrest for cross-dressing. It was referenced everywhere, including in reports about arrest in Greenwich Village in the weeks and months leading up to the 1969 Stonewall riots. So, a lot of times you'll see the stereotype of, like drag queens and that sort of thing wearing 20 different articles of clothing. This is sort of the origin of that. So, sodomy, cross-dressing, it was illegal. Organized crime and police corruption was common. The queer community did not like this arrangement. They didn't like the mafia. That was who harbored them. But again, it was sort of like, what choice did they have? The mafia was who would take them in. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the mafia, with regular bribes being made to police. Bribes often meant, they couldn't really stop the raids. There were these raids on places such as the Stonewall Inn, to sort of find cross-dressers and sodomites and that sort of thing. A bribe usually meant, hey, here's like a 2-hour heads up, everybody get out and, hide the liquor and that sort of thing. No tip seems to have been given on the night of June 28th, 1969. The police raid itself. So we had 4 police officers. They conducted an unannounced raid, and the Stonewall Inn had about 200 patrons at the time. So, right from the start, probably a little mismanaged, way outnumbered. And they started detaining people at this time. It started with some passive resistance, just a general sort of lack of cooperation. This was certainly not the first time that a gay nightclub and that sort of thing had been raided. But it started with sort of a passive resistance. Patrol wagons, which were, meant to, take, people who are getting arrested, take them away. They were late to the scene, and a crowd had begun gathering outside the Stonewall Inn. And, it was a scene, right? bystanders started throwing pennies and heckling the cops. These pennies made way for beer bottles. We shall overcome was famously sung at this time. And then sort of the I don't know if you want to call the singular flashpoint. A typical New York butch, as she was described, scuffled with police and shouted to the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" And I don't know, it's just such a whatever powerful moment in my mind. There's this quote from the time. We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of this shit. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anybody else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night in the one particular place, and it was not an organized demonstration. Okay, this was the moment. There's your, depending again on, historians differ, but there's your, stone cold butch right there. The riots themselves, the crowd had grown to about 500 people at this point. Projectiles grew in size. Parking meters were ripped up from the ground. Bricks were thrown. The police barricaded themselves within the stone wall itself with a number of patrons for their own safety. A battering ram was fashioned, a fire was started, these homosexuals and transgender, these queer folks are, trying to break into this building to, free the people that had been taken in there. Riot police arrived. And this could have been the end right here. But the crowd was not intimidated. So here, I have a few quotes here. So I guess, this one. So I just can't get that one sight out of my mind. The cops with nightsticks and the kick line on the other side. So quite famously, the rioters at this point were doing one of those, I don't know, you've seen like the kick line and that sort of thing. We're doing a kick line opposite riot police. It was the most amazing thing. And all of a sudden, that kick line, which I guess was a spoof on the machismo, I think that's when I felt rage, because people were getting smashed with bats. And for what? A kick line. And it sort of built this outrage, I had been in enough riots to know the fun was over. The cops were totally humiliated. This never happened. They were angrier than I guess they had ever been because everybody else had rioted. But the fairies were not supposed to riot. No group had ever forced cops to retreat before. So the anger was just enormous. I mean, they wanted to kill. And and then just, final quote here, gay power, isn't that great? It's about time we did something to assert ourselves. The guys there were so beautiful. They've lost that wounded look that fags all had 10 years ago. Like I said, turning point, so riot police arrived, crowds would disperse only to quickly reform. They held the day, basically. The riots continued for several days after this. They would dissipate eventually on their own accord. The match of, gay liberation was lit. Sort of talk about the legacy of Stonewall. LGBTQ plus folks around the world felt empowered. Enough had been enough. The first Pride Parade took place in New York City the following year, in 1970. The reason that we celebrate Pride in June here is because of the Stonewall riots. Laws began to be pulled back slowly, state by state. I want to share this little moment too. You know, I talked earlier about the sort of doing things the right way and that sort of thing, because there were, you know, gay rights, you know, activists and that sort of thing during the earlier 1960s. But I'll just read this little quote here. Since 1965, the pickets had been very controlled. Women wore skirts and men wore suits and ties, and all marched quietly in organized lines. This year, Rodwell remembered feeling restricted by the rules that Kameny had set. When two women spontaneously held hands, Kameny broke them apart, saying, "None of that, none of that." Rodwell, however, convinced about 10 couples to hold hands. The hand-holding couples made Kameny furious, but they earned more press attention than all of the previous marches. Participant Lily Vincent remembered, it was clear that things were changing. People who had felt oppressed now felt empowered. That was sort of the mood immediately after Stonewall. You know, again, Stonewall happened in 1969. It sort of started this wave of decriminalization of same-sex sexual intercourse in the United States. You know, just starting in 1971 here. The last dates, you know, the yellow here, 2003, which is probably a lot more recent than I think a lot of folks here maybe fully realize. That was a Supreme Court decision there. I'll sort of end with sort of the following decades. You know, this is becoming less history and more modern times now at this point. The Stonewall riots, I will say, unfortunately, have not solved everything. Culturally and legally, LGBTQ plus folks continue to fight. Not necessarily going to read every event here, but you know, in 1973, in direct response, perhaps, to the Stonewall riots, many states began explicitly banning same-sex marriage. You know, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s was exceptionally harsh. Let's see here, 2003, that Supreme Court ruling that said sodomy laws are unconstitutional. I believe there were some 20 states that still had it illegal at that point in time. 2004, states began permitting same-sex marriage. With 2015, again, another Supreme Court decision made it so that way it was legal in all 50 states. Again, only 10 years ago. That's really not that long ago. Let's see, 2024, Sarah McBride is elected the first transgender member of Congress. And then all the way up to the modern day, you know, just some of the things that the queer community is facing right now. There is a large number of executive orders with unclear legal status. You know, famously, like transgender, the word transgender is being scrubbed from a lot of federal language and that sort of thing. Iowa, it became the first state to remove gender identity as a protected category. Sort of this, you know, latest anti-transgender wave of, you know, legislation that's been passed. Currently, there are 588 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been introduced to state legislatures. So certainly not all roses. But you know, this is a reminder that you know, our legacy, you know, it was born, you know, in the you know, Stonewall riots. Certainly, you know, throughout history, queer folks have been on the fringes and marginalized and that sort of thing. But just sort of some final takeaways here. LGBTQ plus individuals have always existed, and our rights were hard earned. The battle is not over. We are living in it right now. So what can you do? I'll just sort of leave you with this. What can you do? Yeah, demonstrate, peacefully. I'm not going to, advocate for anything else. Vote for policymakers that support LGBTQ plus rights. Have a conversation with an acquaintance, just, spread the message and that sort of thing. Broadcast your support through, flags and stickers and that sort of thing. Just let people know that, you are an ally, and slowly you can help to change the culture around you. Challenge bigotry, don't let it just go unchallenged. If somebody says something that you disagree with, make sure that they know that. You could support LGBTQ plus businesses and media. Speak up when it's inconvenient. It's not always going to be easy. In fact, it rarely is. But being able to speak up is powerful. Educating yourself and others. Hopefully you learned something here today. Be aware of misinformation. In this day and age, misinformation is everywhere. Dispelling misinformation was certainly not the point of this presentation. That's something that you'll need to, do on your own, unfortunately. Supporting your BRGs, that of course is very helpful. And then just celebrate queer joy, I will say, just speaking from my own personal experience, it is a joy. Like, I'm not gonna say it's, easy, but it is, I can't imagine any other way. And just make sure that you remember to celebrate some of that. So. Done a lot of talking, but are there any questions or anything, any comments anybody would like to say?
Sorry.
Oh, well, thank you.
I just want to say it's the second year I've been here in this lunch, and I am always learning. Thanks for your time, and thanks for everything you guys have been doing for this site and all education. And yeah, congrats. I think you did great. A lot of information. Thanks for everything you share.
Thank you.
I also wanted to say thank you. That was a lot of history. I bet a lot of us didn't know, and I could just imagine how much work was put into putting that together. So I really appreciate that. And as a side note, I appreciate the cat pictures too.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, no, it was a lot. So thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we maybe have some extra food in the back. Please help yourselves. Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to remind people again about Iowa City Pride on Saturday, June 21st. Just that we have a sign up sheet for volunteers. You can volunteer for times at the booth, or to walk in the parade, or both. Family members are welcome, more the merrier. So sign up if you can.
Thank you, everyone. Whew.